Have you ever wondered if there's something deeper to life than just daily tasks and the endless hustle? What if there was a clear path to finding peace, purpose, and true transformation amid all this chaos? Today I want to invite you to embark on a unique journey through the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus shares powerful teachings that go far beyond ancient words. These teachings are actually living tools that can transform your life in a real and lasting way. Let's explore these truths together, which have the power to completely change how you see the world, strengthen your relationships, and bring an inner peace that defies any circumstance. Get ready for an experience that can touch your heart and open new horizons, because what you're about to learn has the potential to transform your life in a way you never imagined. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting and life-changing content. Salt and light of the world. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, Jesus reminds us that we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, a statement that seems simple but carries enormous depth. Imagine the impact you can have in your daily life by living with this awareness. Salt preserves and gives flavor, just as our presence should preserve goodness and justice in a world that often seems to rot under the weight of evil and indifference. Being salt means being that person who transforms the environment with attitudes of kindness, wisdom, and compassion. And are you spreading the flavor of the gospel around you? Besides being salt, Jesus also calls us to be light, light that dispels darkness, that illuminates the path for those who are lost, and that shows God's truth amid the darkness of ignorance. Think about how many times you've been a light in someone's life, maybe by offering a word of comfort or acting with mercy. This light isn't just yours, it comes from God and must be shared, just as the sun shines on everyone equally. Have you reflected on how your life can be a reflection of Christ's light for those who are searching for a greater purpose? Being salt and light means living with a purpose of transformation. This manifests not only in big gestures, but also in small daily actions. When you act with mercy, are kind to someone who needs support, or simply live according to Christ's teachings, you are being that light that Jesus calls us to be. Being salt and light is above all about being an agent of change in the world, inspiring others to seek the kingdom of heaven. Are you ready for this challenge? Are you willing to be the difference you want to see? There is a spiritual responsibility involved in being salt and light, a mission that goes beyond what the eyes can see. It's not about seeking applause or recognition, but about living a life that inspires others to seek truth and justice. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount not only encourages us to shine, but also reminds us that our light cannot be hidden. How have you used your light? Has it guided others toward God's purpose, or has it been hidden under doubts and fears? Maybe it's time to let your light shine even brighter, not for your own benefit but for God's glory. Resisting evil, Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. When Jesus teaches us to love our enemies, he challenges us to break the cycle of hatred that consumes humanity. This teaching may seem almost impossible in a world where it's common to repay evil with evil, but think about it. What do we really gain by holding grudges? Jesus proposes something radically different, something that transcends common human understanding. Loving those who harm us, praying for those who persecute us, is an act of true spiritual wisdom. This requires a strength that doesn't come from us but from God. Can we look at those who hurt us and see an opportunity to show Christ's love? By loving our enemies, we break the vicious cycle of hatred and revenge. This doesn't mean ignoring evil, but responding to it with the compassion that God offers us every day. When someone treats us unjustly, our first reaction is often to retaliate, but Jesus teaches us to seek a different response, one that brings healing, not more pain. He himself gave the greatest example by forgiving those who crucified him. Can we do the same? This is true spiritual revolution, transforming hatred into love, and with that, transforming the world around us. Practicing love for enemies also frees us. Resentment traps us, corrodes us from the inside, but forgiveness opens us to the peace God desires for us. By praying for those who offend us, we release the weight of grudges and allow God to work in their lives and ours. Imagine the peace you can achieve when you choose the path of forgiveness instead of carrying the heavy burden of bitterness. It's not easy, but it's the path that brings us closer to Christ. Are you willing to let go of resentment and experience this peace? In the end, loving our enemies reflects the unconditional love that God has for us. He doesn't distinguish between the righteous and the unjust when He sends His grace and mercy. We, as followers of Christ, are called to do the same. You may wonder how this is possible in practice. The first step is to pray, not just for yourself, but for those who hurt you. Pray for peace, for healing, and for transformation. From this prayer, you'll begin to see that love, even for enemies, is a choice God empowers you to make. Are you ready to take this step of faith? Humility and poverty of spirit in the Beatitudes. Humility is a virtue that challenges the norms of the modern world, where self-sufficiency is seen as an unquestionable quality. Jesus, however, teaches us something completely opposite when He talks about the poor in spirit. He invites us to recognize our total dependence on God, reminding us that no matter how much we try to control everything, our true strength comes from trusting in the Lord. Being poor in spirit isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Acknowledging our spiritual need opens the way to receive the blessings of the kingdom of heaven. Are we ready to set aside pride and embrace this humility? Today's society values self-sufficiency greatly, but Jesus teaches us that true transformation begins when we recognize that we cannot do everything alone. Look around. How many people try to fill their spiritual void with material achievements? But in the end, none of it truly satisfies. When we are poor in spirit, we recognize that only God can fill that void. Maybe you've tried in various ways to find that purpose in life, but you realize something is missing. That something is God's presence, which can only be found in humility and surrender. Being poor in spirit also means accepting that we don't have all the answers and that our wisdom is limited. This acceptance frees us from the pressure of being perfect and sets us on the path to true wisdom, which comes from God. When we recognize our limitations and trust in the Lord, we begin to see life from a higher perspective. Depending on God doesn't weaken us. It strengthens us to face challenges with the certainty that we are not alone. Have you thought about how this trust can transform your life and your daily choices? True humility connects us to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said that those who are poor in spirit will inherit the blessings of the kingdom, and this is not a vague promise but a deep spiritual reality. When we stop trying to solve everything by our own strength and surrender to God's will, we experience peace, wisdom, and purpose. Pride can blind us, but humility reveals the spiritual truths that God has for us. Are you willing to embrace this humility and open yourself to everything that God has prepared for your life? Purity of heart and vision of God in the Beatitudes. Purity of heart is a call to live with integrity, always seeking to please God in everything we do. Jesus teaches us that the pure in heart will see God, but what does that really mean? Having a pure heart isn't just about avoiding sin, but living with genuine intentions, without hidden motives or desires. Inner purity allows us to see God in the small things, in the blessings of everyday life, and in the details that often go unnoticed. And this vision of God is a privilege that gives us clarity and direction. Are you seeking this purity in your thoughts and actions? Maintaining a pure heart, especially in today's world, may seem like a huge challenge. We're bombarded with negative influences and often we're tempted to go with the flow, but Jesus calls us to a higher standard. Purity of heart is like a filter that protects us from temptations and keeps us focused on what truly matters, our relationship with God. A good practice is to reflect every day on our intentions. When acting, ask yourself, does this please God? This is how you can start to build a pure heart aligned with divine purpose. Purity of heart also helps us avoid deception and the distractions of the world. When our hearts are full of sincerity and truth, we can discern what comes from God and what is just noise. Seeing God as promised in the Beatitudes means recognizing His presence in our lives, perceiving His signs and directions. A pure heart is like a clean window that allows us to see God's light without distortions. Have you thought about how you can clean that window and see life through the eyes of faith? Deep down, purity of heart is a journey of transformation. It's not something we achieve all at once, but an ongoing process of drawing closer to God, turning away from everything that separates us from Him. Jesus promises that with a pure heart, we will see God, not just in the future, but in the present. In every detail of our lives, this transformation requires effort, but the rewards are great. Are you prepared to embark on this journey and seek a life that reflects God's light and purity? Meekness and inheriting the earth in the Beatitudes. Meekness for many is mistakenly associated with weakness, but Jesus reveals something surprising. The meek will inherit the earth. The meekness that Christ teaches us is controlled strength, an unshakable patience amid adversity. Being meek means having a calm and confident spirit in God, even when everything around us seems chaotic. While the world preaches aggressiveness and unchecked ambition, Jesus shows us that true inheritance lies in living with serenity and balance. Have you ever wondered how meekness can transform your daily interactions, bringing peace where there is conflict? A clear example of meekness is when Jesus, even while being insulted and humiliated, did not respond with violence but maintained His inner peace. And how can we apply this lesson in our daily lives? When someone provokes us or when situations spiral out of control, we often react explosively. But meekness invites us to take a deep breath, trust in God, and act with wisdom. A good exercise is to practice intentional patience in stressful situations, seeking peace instead of feeding confusion. This is how meekness shapes us and brings us closer to inheriting the promises of the kingdom. Being meek also helps us cultivate healthier relationships. Meekness promotes peace, and peace is essential for building lasting connections. When we act with meekness, we reflect the very nature of Christ, who called us to be peacemakers. Imagine how your relationships could improve if, instead of reacting with anger or impatience, you chose meekness. This virtue opens doors for dialogue, for understanding, and makes us heirs of a land where justice and goodness reign. How can you practically bring more meekness into your relationships? Jesus' promise for the meek is not just symbolic, it reflects a spiritual reality. The one who is meek inherits not only the earth in the physical sense, but also the blessings of the kingdom of heaven. By living in meekness, we allow God to be our defender. We trust that He is in control of all things. This trust frees us from the burden of always fighting for our rights or trying to control outcomes. Meekness teaches us to let God lead the way. Are you willing to let go of the need for control and allow meekness to guide your life? Hunger and thirst for righteousness in the Beatitudes. Hunger and thirst for righteousness are more than just a simple desire. They are a deep, almost visceral need that moves the heart of those who long for the kingdom of God. Jesus tells us that blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. But what does it really mean to hunger for righteousness? It's not just about wanting the world to be more just, but living a life that reflects divine values of integrity, equity, and compassion. When we feel this hunger and thirst, we seek justice in all areas, in how we treat others, in our decisions, and in our daily actions. Have you ever felt this deep desire to do what is right, even when no one is watching? In a world where injustice seems to prevail, this hunger and thirst for righteousness drive us to be agents of change. But this change starts within us. To be just, we must seek God's justice, not our own version of it. For example, we can practice justice in our workplace, by being fair to our colleagues, or in our families, by treating everyone with equality and respect. Small actions reflect great transformations. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness means committing to a life that, above all, honors God. Have you stopped to reflect on how this can be applied in your daily life? This pursuit of justice also draws us closer to God, for it is He who fills us. When we seek justice with sincerity of heart, He guides us, gives us wisdom, and strengthens us to do what is right, even amid adversity. It's not easy, but Jesus' promise is clear. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be satisfied. Imagine what it would be like to live a life where you daily feel the satisfaction of being aligned with God's principles. This satisfaction is a peace that transcends circumstances, a certainty that in the end, God's justice will prevail. Are you willing to seek this justice in your life? In the end, this hunger and thirst lead us to be instruments of transformation. It's not enough to wish the world were more just. We must act to make it happen. This can start with simple actions, such as getting involved in causes that promote social justice or helping those who are marginalized and forgotten. The hunger and thirst for righteousness challenge us to step out of our comfort zone and be the hands and feet of Christ on earth. Are you ready to embrace this calling and be filled by the justice that comes from God? Mercy and received mercy in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. These words of Jesus are an invitation to live a life marked by compassion and forgiveness. The mercy He asks of us is not just simple kindness, but a deep attitude of grace and empathy, especially towards those who don't deserve it. When we choose to be merciful, we are imitating the very heart of God, who offers us mercy daily. In a world where harshness and judgment prevail, how can you exercise mercy? Think of someone who needs your compassion today, perhaps a comforting word, an unexpected help, or even the forgiveness you've been reluctant to give. Mercy not only alleviates others' suffering, but also transforms us from within. When we are merciful, we free ourselves from the weight of bitterness and resentment. Jesus promises that those who practice mercy will also receive mercy. And this promise is not just for the future, but something we experience in the present, in each act of kindness we spread. By being merciful, we open space for God's mercy in our own lives. Have you thought about how your small acts of compassion can be seeds that bear fruits of mercy in your own journey? The practice of mercy often requires us to set aside our own pride and ego. When someone hurts us, our first reaction is often the desire for revenge or retaliation. However, Jesus invites us to a different response, to offer mercy where there is pain. This doesn't mean ignoring justice, but offering grace that goes beyond what is deserved. Imagine how your life could change if instead of repaying evil with evil, you chose to respond with mercy. What relationships could be restored through this attitude? Mercy, when practiced sincerely, is a direct reflection of God's character. It shows that we understand the forgiveness we've been given and are willing to extend it to others. Being merciful is a calling that goes beyond an isolated action. It's a lifestyle that reflects the kingdom of heaven. And as we spread this mercy in the world, God promises that we will be rewarded with His infinite mercy. Are you willing to adopt this posture of mercy in your daily life and experience the depth of this beatitude, teaching on anger? Jesus teaches us that anger is not just an emotion that can be ignored or left unchecked. It's a powerful force that can lead us to sin. When He says that whoever is angry with their brother is subject to judgment, He is calling us to a much greater responsibility over our thoughts and emotions. Anger can start as a small irritation, but if fed, it can grow into bitterness, resentment, and eventually destructive actions. Have you ever stopped to think about how uncontrolled anger can harm your relationships and even your spiritual health? Controlling anger is more than just staying calm in moments of frustration. It's a spiritual practice of reconciliation. Jesus encourages us to resolve our differences quickly before anger has a chance to take root in our hearts. Imagine how our relationships would be different if instead of harboring resentments, we chose immediate reconciliation. Instead of holding grudges, the challenge is to act quickly to restore peace. A practice that can help is doing what Jesus suggests, seeking dialogue before letting anger take over. Who in your life can you reach out to today to reconcile? Moreover, Jesus warns us against hasty judgment. How many times have we been angry over something that in the end wasn't that serious? Or worse, how often have we judged others without first examining our own mistakes? Anger blinds our ability to see clearly and can lead us to unjustly condemn others. The challenge Jesus presents is to look inward, control our thoughts and emotions before we act or speak. How about reflecting on your recent actions in moments of anger? How could they have been different if love and patience had guided your actions? Mastering anger is undoubtedly an internal battle, but it's a battle worth fighting because when we win it, we promote peace and harmony in our lives and relationships. Jesus calls us to this internal transformation so that we can live according to the values of the kingdom of heaven. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with small steps, like recognizing anger when it arises and praying for God to give us control over it. Are you ready to begin this journey of inner transformation and seek the peace that comes from mastering anger? Teaching on adultery of the heart, Jesus teaches us that the sin of adultery doesn't begin with the act, but with the thought. When he says that whoever looks at a woman with impure intentions has already committed adultery in his heart, he shows us that purity is much more than just controlling our external actions. The heart, where our desires and intentions are formed, is the true battleground. Our spiritual struggles begin in the mind, where we are tempted to nurture thoughts that distance us from God. Have you reflected on how your thoughts shape your actions? How can you protect your heart from temptation? For Jesus, purity of heart is essential because it reflects the state of our soul before God. That's why he calls us to take serious measures to avoid temptation. This might mean avoiding places, situations, or even people that could lead us to impure thoughts or behaviors. A practical example would be limiting the consumption of content that promotes immorality, whether in movies, social media, or conversations. Sometimes it's necessary to make tough choices to maintain heart purity. Have you been vigilant about the influences you consume daily? Jesus teaches us that to overcome temptation, we must be radical in our approach. He talks about cutting off whatever makes us stumble, a metaphor for eliminating from our lives anything that might lead us away from God. This doesn't mean living isolated or in fear, but being willing to sacrifice anything that compromises our spiritual purity. Perhaps it's time for you to reflect. Is there something in your life that needs to be cut off so you can draw closer to God? This step may be difficult, but it's essential for living in holiness. The transformation Jesus proposes isn't just external, but begins internally. He wants to free us from a life governed by worldly desires and lead us to a life of purity and holiness. And this is only possible with God's help through prayer, repentance, and a constant pursuit of His grace. If you feel like you've been struggling with impure thoughts, remember that God's grace is sufficient to renew you. Are you willing to seek this inner transformation that begins in the heart and live a life that reflects Christ's love and holiness? Oaths and honesty. Jesus teaches us that honesty should be the foundation of all our words and actions. When he says that our yes should be yes and our no should be no, he is calling us to live with integrity. We don't need oaths or elaborate words to prove we're telling the truth. Our daily actions should already reflect that sincerity. When we live by this principle, we show the world that we are trustworthy and that our word has value. How have you practiced honesty in your life? Has your word been enough for people to trust you? In today's world, where distrust often prevails, living with honesty can be a powerful testimony of faith. Truth strengthens relationships and builds a solid foundation of trust. Think about your personal and professional relationships. Are your words always honest and clear? A simple way to apply this teaching is to avoid exaggerations or promises you can't keep, whether at home or work. Being honest, even in small details, reflects the character of Christ in us. Have you been faithful to the commitment to live with the integrity Jesus teaches us? Moreover, the honesty Jesus proposes isn't limited to words alone. He calls us to live in such a way that our actions are consistent with what we say. Often people can be quick to promise but slow to fulfill. Jesus teaches us that we shouldn't manipulate others with empty words or oaths that we have no intention of keeping. Living with this transparency means that our lives will be a reflection of our faith, and the people around us will know they can trust us. Have you stopped to think if your actions align with your words? The life of a follower of Christ should be an example of honesty and integrity in all areas. When we live this way, we avoid unnecessary complications and misunderstandings that can arise from lies or broken promises. This honesty not only draws us closer to people, but also brings us closer to God, who calls us to live a righteous and upright life. Are you willing to adopt this radical honesty that Jesus teaches us and allow it to transform your relationships and your spiritual walk? Peacemakers and children of God in the Beatitudes. Jesus calls us to be peacemakers, and this goes far beyond simply avoiding conflict. Being a peacemaker is actually active work in building bridges, reconciling differences, and promoting harmony wherever we are. He says that peacemakers will be called children of God because they reflect the very divine nature. By seeking peace, we are imitating the character of the Heavenly Father, who desires peace among all his children. In a world full of divisions, have you ever thought about how you can be an agent of peace in your family, at work, or in your community? Being a peacemaker doesn't mean being passive, but having the courage to face conflicts with a heart of love and a desire for reconciliation. Often, this stance requires more strength than simply entering an argument or seeking revenge. A peacemaker positions themselves as an intermediary, seeking solutions and promoting mutual understanding. Imagine, for example, how your relationships could change if instead of reacting with hostility, you always sought the path of reconciliation. Perhaps a co-worker, friend, or even family member is waiting for a peacemaking attitude from you. What can you do to take that first step? The peacemaker is also someone who seeks justice, because true peace can only exist where there is equity and respect. Jesus teaches us to be peacemakers, not only in our personal interactions, but also in the way we address larger issues in the world around us. We can be peacemakers by standing up for the marginalized, promoting justice, and fighting against the oppressions we see. Being a peacemaker is in many ways being the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Are you willing to fight for peace and justice, even when it means going against the current? Jesus promises that peacemakers will be called children of God, a spiritual reward that transcends any earthly recognition. By working for peace, we show that we are aligned with the heart of God, who is loving and just. But being a peacemaker is a daily challenge that requires prayer, wisdom, and patience. Are you prepared to accept this calling and live as a true child of God, being an instrument of peace in a world so in need of reconciliation and harmony? Persecution for righteousness in the Beatitudes. Jesus reminds us that persecution for the sake of righteousness is a reality for those who follow his teachings. He declares, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," showing that suffering for doing what is right has eternal value. When we stand up for justice, aligned with the principles of God's kingdom, we may face opposition and misunderstanding. In a world where injustice is often tolerated, being just can cause discomfort. Have you ever faced resistance for trying to act according to your faith? How did you respond to this challenge? Persecution is not something we should seek, but when it comes, Jesus teaches us to face it with courage and hope. He promises us a heavenly reward, and this certainty gives us the strength to remain firm. By defending the marginalized, being a voice against injustice, or refusing to give in to corrupt practices, you may experience opposition. However, this opposition is not the end, but a sign that you are on the right path. An example of this is when we see people who in their professions refuse to yield to corruption, even when it brings them problems. Where in your life have you been called to stand for justice, even when it costs you? Persecution for righteousness, besides being a test of faith, is an opportunity to witness God's love and faithfulness. When we face opposition with serenity and confidence, we show the world that our faith is greater than our circumstances. By being persecuted for doing good, we are closer to Christ, who also suffered persecution for the sake of truth. He teaches us that just as the kingdom of heaven is his, it is also ours when we remain firm. Have you reflected on how your choices for justice can impact the environment around you while also strengthening your faith? Jesus' promise for those who suffer persecution for righteousness is clear. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. There is no greater reward than this. Persecution may seem hard now, but what awaits us is an eternity with God. So when facing difficulties for following Christ's principles, remember this promise. Are you willing to stay firm in the face of difficulties, trusting that your faithfulness will be rewarded by God and that your suffering for justice has eternal value? Mourning and comfort in the Beatitudes. Jesus teaches us that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, a promise that brings hope and comfort to those going through moments of pain and loss. Mourning, whether for a physical or spiritual loss, is something we all face at some point in life. The pain can be overwhelming, but Jesus offers us something beyond simple human consolation. He promises us divine comfort. This comfort is deep and goes beyond words, for it comes from the very heart of God. Have you ever stopped to reflect on how, even in moments of great sadness, God is present, offering his peace and comfort? Sorrow can be a path to drawing closer to God, a moment when we recognize our fragility and total dependence on him. In mourning, we often confront our limitations and the need for something greater to sustain us. It is in this moment that God's presence becomes more evident, when we turn to him in prayer and trust. For many, moments of mourning are transformative, because it is in pain that we find true strength. Think about how your losses can become a meeting point with God, where he restores what was broken and offers new hope. Mourning can also be an opportunity to grow in compassion for others. When we go through pain and are comforted by God, we become more capable of comforting those around us. Jesus invites us to be agents of comfort, bringing solace to those who suffer. A simple gesture like a word of encouragement, a prayer, or just being present can be the way God uses you to bring comfort to someone. Who in your life needs that comfort today? You can be God's presence in that person's life. In the end, Jesus promises that those who mourn will be comforted. This comfort is not just a promise for the future, but something we can experience here and now. God's comfort is a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that turns mourning into hope. Even if the pain persists, God's presence sustains us, renewing us day by day. Are you willing to open your heart and allow God's comfort to transform your pain into strength and your mourning into a new perspective on life? Fulfillment of the law in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Jesus makes it clear that he didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. This shows us that God's principles, established from the beginning, remain and have an eternal purpose. Jesus isn't rejecting the law. On the contrary, he completes it, revealing its true meaning. He calls us to live not just according to external rules, but to understand the spirit behind those laws. It's easy to follow rules without understanding their purpose, but Jesus wants our obedience to be the fruit of a transformed heart. Have you stopped to think about how God's commandments can shape your character and your life more deeply? Fulfilling the law, as Jesus teaches us, isn't just about strictly following a set of norms, but living according to the love and justice that God's law reveals. Jesus invites us to go beyond appearances and see the true purpose behind each commandment, to love God and love others. When we look at the law through the eyes of Christ, we realize it's not a burden, but a guide for a full and just life. And you? Have you sought to understand the heart of the law? Or are you just following rituals? What could change if you began to live with this new perspective? Jesus, by saying he came to fulfill the law, shows us that he is the fulfillment of all the promises and prophecies of the Old Testament. In him, we find the perfect expression of divine justice and love. His sacrifice not only fulfills the requirements of the law, but also empowers us to live it in a way that we could never do on our own. Now, with the help of the Holy Spirit, we are called to live this justice completely, not just outwardly, but from the inside out. How can your life reflect this transformative justice that Jesus came to bring? Fulfilling the law in Jesus' view is not a matter of merit, but of grace. He came to show us that on our own we could never perfectly fulfill the law, but through him, we are empowered to live in righteousness. Jesus not only points the way, but leads us along it, showing that true justice comes from a heart transformed by his grace. Are you willing to allow Jesus to fulfill in you what you cannot achieve on your own, living a life that reflects God's justice and love? So how about starting today to apply these principles in your life? How can you become salt and light in the world? What can you do to be a peacemaker or practice more mercy? Change begins with small steps. And remember, the kingdom of heaven is for those who have the courage to follow this path. If you want to continue on this journey of transformation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more teachings that will help you walk with more purpose and wisdom.